1945 wasn't a rebirth of American engineering. It was a desperate restart. Factories were coming off wartime production, materials were scarce, and automakers rushed outdated pre-war designs back onto the road. Safety didn't exist. Testing was minimal. What buyers got were cars that looked hopeful and drove like liabilities. These 7 machines prove that post-war optimism rolled out before common sense.
Please support us and subscribe to the channel. Thank you.
The Ford Deluxe 4-door 1940 took everything that already strained the limits of Ford's entry-level engineering and made it worse by adding weight. More doors, more glass, more steel, more passengers. What it did not add was braking capacity, structural sophistication, or any meaningful increase in control. The result was a deceptively dignified family sedan whose stopping distances were frightening even at modest speeds. A car that looked calmer, safer, and more substantial than the Tudor, while being far more dangerous the moment urgency entered the equation. Ford sold the Deluxe 4-door as a sensible upgrade. 4 doors meant convenience. Extra trim meant refinement. Families trusted it instinctively. They believed they were buying something sturdier, something more secure. In reality, they were buying additional mass bolted to the same weak braking system that already struggled to stop lighter Fords. Physics did not care about trim levels or good intentions. The braking system was the 4-door's central failure. Small drum brakes, marginal even in ideal conditions, were asked to slow a significantly heavier vehicle carrying more passengers and luggage. At low speeds and with gentle inputs, the system felt adequate. That illusion shattered the moment a driver pressed the pedal with urgency. Pedal travel increased. Response dulled. Deceleration lagged behind expectation. The car simply did not slow at the rate a human brain assumes it should. Even at city speeds, stopping distances were alarmingly long. What should have been routine stops became white-knuckle events. Drivers learned to leave enormous gaps, coast early, and avoid sudden braking whenever possible. When traffic did something unexpected, as traffic always does, the 4-door punished hesitation with inevitability. Repeated braking made everything worse. Heat built rapidly in the drums, and fade arrived early. Each successive stop required more pedal pressure for less effect. Drivers often didn't realize how compromised the brakes were until they needed them most. By then, it was too late. Rear-end collisions were common not because drivers were inattentive, but because the car could not convert intent into deceleration fast enough. The added weight of the 4-door magnified every flaw. Momentum rose dramatically with even small increases in speed. The car felt stable because it was heavy, but that stability was an illusion created by inertia, not control. Once moving, the 4-door resisted change, whether that change was slowing down or changing direction. Handling offered no escape. Steering response was slow and vague. Large inputs were required for modest directional changes, and those changes arrived late. In emergencies, drivers instinctively steered harder to compensate for the delay. When the front end finally responded, it often did so abruptly, unsettling the rear. Overcorrection followed. Loss of control did not require speed, only surprise. The suspension, tuned for comfort rather than discipline, allowed excessive pitch under braking. The nose dove sharply. The rear lightened. Tire grip became inconsistent. Instead of helping the car stop, the suspension actively reduced braking effectiveness by unloading the rear tires and overwhelming the fronts. Braking and steering together, a necessity in real emergencies, pushed the 4-door into its most unstable state. Inside, the illusion of safety persisted. The 4-door felt quiet, solid, and composed. That calm masked danger. Drivers underestimated speed because the car insulated them from noise and vibration. Faster speeds reduced reaction time. Reduced reaction time demanded stronger braking. Strong braking was exactly what the car could not deliver. When collisions occurred, the interior offered no mercy. A rigid steering column connected directly to the steering box became a direct conduit for crash forces. In frontal impacts, the column surged rearward as the driver surged forward. The steering wheel struck the chest and face with devastating force. Sternum fractures, crushed ribs, and internal injuries were common outcomes, even in crashes that did not look severe from the outside. The steel dashboard compounded the violence. There was no padding worth mentioning. Heads struck painted metal, knees smashed into rigid panels, rear seat passengers were thrown forward into unyielding seatbacks, and then into the front cabin beyond. Seatbelts did not exist. Occupants became projectiles inside a steel box. Families suffered the worst consequences. The Ford Deluxe four-door was chosen precisely because it carried more people. More people meant more mass and more injury in every collision. Children in the rear seat were especially vulnerable, launched forward without restraint, often striking hard surfaces at chest or head height. What makes the Deluxe four-door especially disturbing is how normal it felt. This was not a crude or alarming vehicle. It felt respectable, trustworthy, mature. That feeling encouraged everyday use without caution. When the car failed, it did so without warning and without forgiveness. Medical and accident reports from the era reveal familiar patterns: long skid marks ending too late, rear end impacts at intersections, frontal crashes at speeds that should have been survivable. Investigators noted that braking failure, not recklessness, was often the initiating factor. The car did not lack warning signs, it lacked capability. Ford engineers knew the limitations. Better brakes would have helped. Larger drums, improved cooling, stronger components, all were technically possible, but cost and production scale ruled decisions. The same brakes were used because they were cheap, proven, and already in production. The four-door paid the price for that economy with interest. The irony is sharp. The Deluxe four-door was meant to be the safer choice, the family choice. Instead, it was the more dangerous one. Heavier than the Tudor, yet stopped by the same inadequate hardware, it crossed a threshold where margin vanished entirely. Only years later would the industry begin to accept that braking systems must be sized for worst-case scenarios, not average use. That lesson was learned slowly, through collisions that should never have happened. Cars like the four-door wrote that lesson in hospital records rather than engineering textbooks. Today, the 1940 Deluxe Ford four-door often admired for its classic lines and solid presence. It looks reassuring, substantial, almost protective. What those images cannot show is the fear of a driver pressing the brake pedal at a modest speed and realizing the car was not going to stop in time. The Ford Deluxe four-door 1940 teaches one of the most unforgiving lessons in automotive history. Adding weight without control does not increase safety, it destroys it. Weak brakes do not negotiate with momentum. Mass does not compensate for inadequacy, and dignity does not shorten stopping distances. In the four-door, Ford created a family sedan that carried more people toward danger with less ability to avoid it. At modest speeds, the margins were already gone, and once those margins vanished, all that was left was inevitability. The Chrysler Windsor 1945 rolled into post-war America carrying enormous symbolic weight. It was one of the first cars many families saw after years of rationing, blackout curtains, and factory silence. Steel was finally flowing again. Civilian life was restarting. The Windsor looked like reassurance on wheels. Big, solid, conservative, and proudly overbuilt. To buyers exhausted by uncertainty, it felt indestructible. And that was precisely the problem. Because the Windsor's massive steel structure did not absorb crash energy, it transmitted it. When accidents happened, the car survived. The occupants did not. The Windsor was not truly a new car. Like most 1945 models, it was essentially a warmed-over pre-war design rushed back into production. Chrysler had little time, little incentive, and no regulatory pressure to rethink safety. The priority was getting cars out the door. Familiar platforms, familiar tooling, familiar engineering. That engineering philosophy was rooted in a belief that strength equaled safety, that a rigid, durable structure would somehow shield people by refusing to deform. In reality, the Windsor turned the human body into the crumple zone. The car's mass was its defining trait. Thick steel panels, heavy frame rails, and a substantial body made the Windsor feel immovable. Doors closed with a vault-like thud. The ride was calm and steady. At speed, the car felt planted and authoritative. Drivers trusted it instinctively. That trust encouraged speed on roads that were still narrow, uneven, and poorly marked after years of wartime neglect. When something went wrong, the Windsor met the world with brute force and passed that force directly to the people inside. There was no energy absorption strategy in the structure. The front end was short and rigid, designed to stay intact rather than deform progressively. In a frontal collision, the Windsor did not sacrifice itself to protect its occupants. The frame transmitted impact forces rearward in a violent wave. The engine and drivetrain shifted back. The firewall deformed. Pedals were driven toward legs and feet. Instead of the car slowing the occupants gently, the occupants were stopped violently by steel. The steering column completed the assault. Rigid, solid, and directly connected to the steering box, it offered no collapse mechanism and no energy absorption. In a frontal impact, it moved rearward as the driver moved forward. The two met at the chest and face. Sternums fractured, ribs shattered, internal organs were crushed. Survivable crashes became fatal because the steering wheel became a battering ram aimed at the driver's torso. The interior offered no relief. The dashboard was painted steel, shaped for style and manufacturing simplicity, not human impact. There was no padding worth mentioning. Knobs, trim, and edges were hard and unforgiving. In crashes, occupants struck metal immediately. Heads met dashboards. Knees slammed into rigid panels. Rear seat passengers were thrown forward into unyielding seatbacks and then into the steel structures ahead. With no seatbelts, bodies moved freely inside a cabin that was shrinking rapidly. Side impacts were equally merciless. The Windsor's doors were strong in the sense that they held together, but that strength worked against survival. Instead of absorbing energy gradually, the side structure shoved inward as a unit. Intrusion was rapid and deep. Occupant space vanished before bodies could decelerate. Ribs, hips, and spines absorbed forces directly. Survivability depended almost entirely on luck and angle, not design. Rear impacts carried their own dangers. The Windsor's rigid frame transmitted force forward, throwing occupants violently toward the front of the cabin. Fuel systems of the era were poorly protected, and rear deformation often compromised tanks and lines. Fires were an ever-present risk. Survivors of the initial impact sometimes faced a second, deadlier threat seconds later, as fuel leaked and ignited. What made all of this especially tragic was how safe the Windsor felt before the crash. The ride was smooth, noise was muted. The car absorbed bumps effortlessly. 50 miles per hour felt calm. 60 felt effortless. The Windsor encouraged cruising speeds that its safety engineering could not forgive. When traffic slowed unexpectedly or an obstacle appeared, the car demanded braking and evasive capability that simply did not exist. The brakes themselves were marginal for a car of this size and mass. Stopping distances were long even when everything worked perfectly. Under repeated use, fate arrived quickly. Drivers pressed harder and waited longer for results that never came. Rear-end collisions were common precursors to more serious accidents. The Windsor did not lack warning signs, it lacked margin. Medical reports from the immediate post-war years began to show familiar patterns. Chest injuries from steering wheels, facial trauma from dashboards, severe internal injuries without corresponding external vehicle damage. Doctors noticed that occupants of large, rigid cars often suffered worse injuries than those in lighter vehicles that deformed more visibly. The evidence was there, but the industry was slow to listen. Chrysler was not uniquely negligent. The Windsor represented industry-wide thinking frozen in pre-war assumptions. Energy absorption was not yet a design goal. Controlled deformation was not yet understood as protective. Engineers built cars to last decades, not to fail gracefully in milliseconds. The Windsor was excellent at durability. It was catastrophic at crash management. The cruel irony is that the Windsor's structure often remained remarkably intact after severe collisions. Doors still hung on their hinges. Roofs often stayed upright. From the outside, the car looked survivable. Inside, the story was very different. Occupants had absorbed the full impact force that the car refused to manage. The vehicle protected itself. The people paid the price. Families trusted the Windsor because it symbolized post-war stability. It was big, respectable, and American. Parents put children in the back seat believing mass equaled protection. In reality, the lack of restraint systems and energy management made rear seat passengers some of the most vulnerable occupants. They were thrown forward violently, striking hard surfaces with devastating consequences. Only years later would the industry begin to reverse these priorities. Crumple zones, collapsible steering columns, padded dashboards, strong occupant cells surrounded by sacrificial structures. Those ideas were born not from theory, but from the accumulated injuries and deaths caused by cars like the Windsor. The lessons were written in emergency rooms before they were written in engineering textbooks. Today, the 1945 Chrysler Windsor is often viewed with affection. It represents rebirth after war, the return of normal life, the optimism of peace. At car shows, it looks dignified and reassuring, a monument to American manufacturing strength. What those polished restorations cannot show is the violence hidden in that strength, the way the car refused to give, and how that refusal was passed directly to the human body. The Chrysler Windsor 1945 teaches one of the most sobering lessons in automotive history. Safety is not about how much steel a car has. It's about where that steel goes when the car stops suddenly. A structure that does not absorb energy simply redirects it into flesh and bone. In the Windsor, occupants absorbed the full impact force because the car would not. It stood firm while human bodies broke. And in that imbalance between durability and humanity lies the true legacy of the post-war Chrysler Windsor, not as a protector, but as a reminder of how dangerous strength becomes when it refuses to bend. The Buick Special 1945 arrived at a moment when Americans wanted reassurance more than innovation. The war had ended. Factories were reopening, and steel was finally flowing back into civilian life. Buick answered that hunger with mass, thick steel, heavy frames, and the car that felt solid in a way people desperately wanted to believe in. The Special looked dependable, dignified, and calm, as if nothing could disturb it. And that illusion worked perfectly, right up until the moment a driver needed to stop in a hurry. Then the truth emerged with terrifying clarity. The Buick Special carried post-war weight on pre-war brakes, and the stopping distances it produced were not just long, they were frightening. The 1945 Buick Special was essentially a pre-war car reborn without pre-war restraint. Wartime production had paused real development, and when civilian cars returned, they returned quickly, using familiar designs and familiar engineering. Buick did not redesign its braking systems to match the reality of heavier bodies and higher post-war traffic speeds. Instead, it leaned on what it already had: drum brakes that had been marginal before the war and were now asked to perform miracles they were never designed to deliver. The Special was heavy, very heavy. Steel was everywhere, not because it improved safety, but because it improved perception. Doors closed with authority. The body felt substantial. The ride was smooth and insulating. At speed, the Buick felt composed and calm, floating over imperfections with an ease that suggested control. Drivers trusted that feeling instinctively. They cruised faster than they realized because the car muted noise, vibration, and effort. 50 miles per hour felt gentle. 60 felt relaxed. That comfort hid danger. When drivers pressed the brake pedal, the illusion collapsed. The drum brakes simply could not cope with the mass they were asked to arrest. Even at moderate speeds, stopping distances were far longer than drivers expected. The pedal felt firm, but deceleration lagged. The car slowed, but reluctantly, as if it were negotiating rather than obeying. In traffic, this meant constant anxiety, drivers leaving huge gaps, braking early, and still feeling the car surge forward longer than it should. Repeated braking made everything worse. Heat built rapidly inside the drums, and with nowhere to escape, it robbed the brake linings of friction. Fate arrived quietly and then all at once. The same pedal pressure produced less and less effect. Drivers pressed harder. The Buick responded with indifference. Long stopping distances stretched even longer, and moments that should have been routine became moments of panic. Downhill driving was especially terrifying. On long descents, gravity did what gravity always does, and the Buick's brakes fought a battle they cannot win. Each application added heat. Each release offered no relief. By the time drivers realized the brakes were fading, the road was already falling away beneath them. Engine braking offered little help. Gearing and engine characteristics were tuned for smooth cruising, not aggressive deceleration. The Buick gathered speed inexorably, and the driver learned the lesson no brochure ever mentioned. Mass without braking capacity is not security, it is momentum. The suspension did nothing to help. Tuned for comfort above all else, it allowed significant pitch under braking. The nose dove sharply, overloading the front tires and further reducing braking efficiency. The rear lightened, destabilizing the car. Instead of helping the tires stay planted, the suspension undermined them. Braking and steering together, a necessity in real emergencies, pushed the Buick into its worst behavior, where control dissolved into float and delay. Steering response was slow and vague, offering little precision when it was most needed. Drivers attempting last-second evasive maneuvers found the car unwilling to change direction quickly. The body leaned, the tires protested, the road ran out. Rear-end collisions became common, not because drivers were careless, but because the Buick simply could not shed speed fast enough to avoid them. Inside the cabin, the consequences were brutal. Like nearly all cars of its era, the Buick Special featured a rigid steering column aimed directly at the driver's chest. In frontal impacts, the column surged rearward as the driver surged forward. Steering wheels became blunt weapons. Sternums fractured, ribs collapsed, internal injuries followed. The steel dashboard offered no mercy, turning heads and faces into points of impact rather than being softened by any meaningful padding. Passengers suffered no less. Front passengers struck the steel dash directly. Rear seat occupants were thrown forward into rigid seatbacks and then into the unforgiving front cabin beyond. Seatbelts did not exist. Bodies moved freely inside a steel shell that refused to absorb energy. The Buick protected its structure first and its occupants last. What made the Buick Special especially dangerous was how convincingly it lied to its drivers. Everything about the experience suggested safety: the size, the weight, the calm ride, the muted noise. Drivers believed they were insulated from danger because the car insulated them from sensation. That belief encouraged speed, confidence, and shorter reaction windows. When reality intruded, the brakes were not ready. Accident reports from the immediate post-war period tell a consistent story. Long skid marks ending too late. Cars unable to stop at intersections. Rear-end impacts at speeds that should have been survivable. Investigators often noted brake fade and excessive stopping distances as contributing factors. These were not isolated incidents. They were systemic outcomes of a car whose braking system belonged to a lighter, slower era. The tragedy is that none of this required revolutionary solutions. Larger drums, better cooling, improved materials, or more aggressive gearing could have reduced the danger significantly. But those changes added cost and complexity at a time when manufacturers believed buyers wanted familiarity and comfort more than capability. Buick chose reassurance over reserve capacity, and drivers paid the difference in fear. Doctors of the era began to notice patterns: severe chest injuries with minimal external vehicle damage, internal trauma disproportionate to crash severity. These injuries were not mysteries. They were the predictable result of long stopping distances followed by sudden, violent deceleration inside rigid cabins. Buick was not uniquely guilty. The Special reflected industry-wide thinking frozen by war and reactivated without reconsideration. But Buick's scale and reputation magnified the impact. When a car marketed as refined and dependable terrifies drivers with its inability to stop, the failure cuts deeper. Today, the 1945 Buick Special is often remembered as a symbol of post-war optimism, a car that helped America return to normal life. Restored examples glide serenely as shows, admired for their smoothness and presence. What those polished moments cannot show is the white-knuckle fear of a driver pressing the brake pedal and realizing the car was not going to stop in time. The Buick Special teaches one of the most unforgiving lessons in automotive history. Mass without braking authority is not safety, it is danger in slow motion. Heavy bodies magnify mistakes. Weak brakes erase margin. Comfort that masks speed steals the time drivers need to survive. In the Buick Special, drivers learned that reassurance could turn into terror in a heartbeat, and that the calmest feeling cars are sometimes the ones least prepared for urgency. The car did not scream its limits. It whispered them, right up until it ran out of road.
The Packard Clipper 6, 1945, stood at the crossroads between reputation and reality, between what Packard was and what the world was becoming. To the public, the Clipper still carried the aura of pre-war prestige, quiet confidence, dignified styling, and the unspoken promise that a Packard meant safety through quality. To the road, however, it brought forward an older truth. Luxury image without modern safety thinking was not protection, it was exposure. Beneath its refined exterior lived pre-war crash realities, and inside its elegant cabin waited one of the most brutal hazards of the era, a steel dashboard and rigid steering architecture that turned frontal collisions into catastrophic facial and chest injuries. In 1945, Americans were not shopping for innovation, they were shopping for normalcy. The war had paused civilian automotive progress for years, and when cars returned, buyers wanted familiarity and reassurance. Packard delivered exactly that. The Clipper 6 looked calm, balanced, and modern enough without being radical. It felt like a continuation of the world people remembered before everything stopped. That continuity was comforting and dangerous. The Clipper 6 was not truly a new design. Like nearly all immediate post-war cars, it was a pre-war platform restarted with minimal rethinking. Packard's engineering priorities had been frozen in time, and when production resumed, there was neither regulatory pressure nor internal urgency to revisit safety fundamentals. The company still believed what it had believed in the late 1930s, that solidity, refinement, and structural strength were safety. The human body was expected to endure the rest. Nowhere was that belief more brutally expressed than in the interior. The dashboard was steel, painted, sculpted, handsome, and utterly unforgiving. It was designed to look elegant and feel substantial, not to absorb energy. There was no meaningful padding, no deformation strategy, no consideration for what happened when a human head or chest struck it at speed. In a frontal collision, occupants did not encounter a surface designed to slow them gently. They met hard metal instantly. The steering column made things worse. Rigid, solid, and directly connected to the steering gear, it had no collapse mechanism and no energy absorption. In a frontal impact, the car decelerated violently. The engine and frame shifted rearward, and the steering column came with them. At the same moment, the driver's body surged forward. The steering wheel did not yield. It struck. Chest injuries were devastating. Sternums fractured, ribs collapsed inward, internal organs were crushed between bone and metal. Drivers who survived the initial impact often suffered massive internal trauma that proved fatal hours or days later. Facial injuries were equally severe. Heads snapped forward into steel dashboards or steering wheels. Jaws shattered. Teeth were knocked out. Eye sockets fractured. Even crashes at speeds that seemed modest by post-war standards produced injuries that modern observers would associate with far higher velocities. Passengers were not spared. Front passengers struck the steel dashboard directly, often with the full force of unrestrained forward motion. Rear seat occupants were launched forward into rigid front seatbacks and then into the steel structures beyond. Seatbelts were non-existent. Occupants became projectiles inside a beautifully finished metal shell that offered no mercy.
What made this especially tragic was how safe the Clipper felt before the crash. The ride was smooth, noise was muted, the car absorbed bumps effortlessly. Drivers felt insulated from the road, from speed, from urgency. 50 miles per hour felt calm. 60 felt dignified. That calm masked danger. Reaction times shrank while confidence grew. When traffic slowed unexpectedly or an obstacle appeared, the Clipper demanded braking and evasive capability that belonged to a future it had not yet reached. The braking system was marginal for the car's mass. Stopping distances were long even when everything worked perfectly. Under repeated use, fade appeared quickly. Drivers pressed harder and waited longer. In emergencies, that delay turned near misses into impacts. The Clipper did not encourage recklessness, it punished normal reactions with inevitability. The suspension, tuned for comfort and isolation, added another layer of risk. Body motion was soft and slow to settle. Under hard braking, the nose dove, unloading the rear and destabilizing the car. Steering response was measured and deliberate, not quick. In emergency maneuvers, drivers often found the car responding half a beat too late. That half beat was enough to erase margins entirely. When crashes happened, and with rising post-war traffic they happened more often, the Clipper structure did nothing to manage energy intelligently. The body was strong in the sense that it stayed together, but that strength worked against its occupants. Instead of crumpling progressively to absorb force, the structure transmitted impact energy straight into the cabin. The car preserved itself, the people absorbed the violence. Medical reports from the immediate post-war years began to show patterns that would later reshape automotive design. Severe chest trauma without massive external vehicle damage. Facial injuries concentrated around dashboards and steering wheels. Fatal internal injuries from crashes that appeared survivable. Doctors didn't need crash labs to understand what was happening. They saw the same wounds again and again, and many of those wounds came from cars that looked intact afterward. The Packard Clipper 6 was particularly painful in this context because of what Packard represented. This was a brand associated with engineering excellence, with doing things right. Buyers expected more than mere transportation. They expected protection through quality. Instead, they received craftsmanship layered over outdated safety thinking. The Clipper's luxury image did not just fail to protect, it actively disguised risk. Families trusted these cars. Parents put children in the back seat believing mass and prestige equaled safety. In reality, rear seat passengers were among the most vulnerable, thrown forward violently without restraint into a collapsing front cabin filled with steel surfaces. The very quietness and smoothness that defined Packard refinement increased injury severity by encouraging higher cruising speeds on roads that offered little forgiveness. The cruel irony is that the Clipper often looked remarkably intact after severe crashes. Doors might still open. Rooflines often remained straight. From the outside, the car appeared survivable. Inside, occupants had absorbed forces the structure refused to manage. The absence of visible destruction hid catastrophic human damage. Only years later would the industry begin to accept that dashboards must be padded, steering columns must collapse, and structures must sacrifice themselves to protect occupants. Those changes were not acts of generosity. They were responses to undeniable evidence produced by cars like the Clipper 6. The lessons were learned in hospitals before they were written into standards. Today, the 1945 Packard Clipper 6 is often admired as a symbol of post-war elegance and continuity. At shows, it looks refined, calm, and reassuring, a reminder of a time when craftsmanship mattered. What those polished restorations cannot show is the violence hidden behind that elegance, the way steel dashboards shattered faces and rigid steering columns crushed chests. The Packard Clipper 6, 1945, teaches one of the most sobering lessons in automotive history. Luxury does not equal safety. An image does not absorb impact. A beautiful interior can still be lethal. A prestigious badge cannot soften physics. When a car refuses to absorb energy, the human body will. In the Clipper 6, Packard delivered comfort, dignity, and reputation, but left its occupants to face crashes with pre-war defenses in a post-war world.
The result was a car that looked protective and felt reassuring, yet turned frontal collisions into moments of devastating intimacy between flesh and steel. And that contrast between promise and outcome is what makes the Clipper 6 not just outdated, but unforgettable in the most uncomfortable way possible. The Chevrolet Fleetmaster 1945 arrived at a moment when Americans were desperate to believe that normal life had returned. After years of war, rationing, and uncertainty, the Fleetmaster looked like stability made of steel. It was familiar, conservative, and reassuringly heavy. Chevrolet marketed it as dependable family transportation. Nothing radical, nothing risky, just honest motoring resumed. But beneath that comforting image lived a set of pre-war compromises that had become far more dangerous in a post-war world. A sluggish inline-six that forced risky driving decisions, brakes that struggled even under modest demands, and fragile frame rails that failed catastrophically in rear impacts combined to make the Fleetmaster one of the most quietly dangerous cars of its era. Worse still, those same rear impacts often ruptured the fuel system, turning survivable collisions into fires. The Fleetmaster was not a clean sheet design. Like most 1945 cars, it was essentially a pre-war machine rushed back into production. Chevrolet had neither the time nor the incentive to rethink safety fundamentals. The priority was speed to market. Factories restarted using familiar tooling, familiar frames, and familiar assumptions about how cars should behave in crashes. Those assumptions were already outdated before the war. By 1945, they were lethal. The engine defined the first layer of danger. Chevrolet's inline-six was smooth and reliable, but painfully underpowered for a car that had grown heavier and was now operating in faster traffic. Acceleration was slow. Throttle response was dull. Merging required patience and long run-ups. Passing on two-lane roads demanded extended exposure in the oncoming lane. Drivers were forced to commit early and stay committed longer than conditions allowed. The car did not lack reliability, it lacked urgency. That lack of urgency changed driver behavior in subtle but dangerous ways. Drivers carried more speed than they otherwise would because regaining speed was difficult. They hesitated to slow fully. They delayed braking. They accepted smaller margins. In traffic that was rapidly densifying after the war, those habits became risky very quickly. The Fleetmaster encouraged decisions that assumed nothing unexpected would happen, and reality does not honor that assumption. When drivers did try to slow down, the brakes revealed the second major flaw. The braking system was marginal even by 1945 standards. Drum brakes sized for lighter, slower pre-war cars were now asked to stop a heavier sedan moving at higher average speeds. At first, the system felt adequate. The pedal was firm, the car slowed eventually, but stopping distances were long, far longer than drivers expected. What should have been routine stops became anxious waits. Repeated braking exposed the real danger. Heat built rapidly inside the drums, and with nowhere to escape, it robbed the linings of friction. Fade arrived quietly and then all at once. The same pedal pressure produced less deceleration. Drivers pressed harder, discovering too late that effort could not replace capacity. In traffic, this often meant rear-end collisions that should have been avoided. Those rear-end collisions were where the Fleetmaster became truly unforgiving. The frame rails were fragile, especially at the rear. They were not designed to manage impact energy intelligently. In rear impacts, the structure collapsed forward unevenly, deforming in ways that compromised everything mounted to it. The fuel tank and fuel lines were poorly protected and poorly isolated from that deformation. When the rear structure crushed forward, tanks split, seams ruptured, and fuel lines tore loose. Gasoline spilled freely beneath and behind the car. Ignition was frighteningly easy. Sparks from crushed metal, exposed wiring, or dragging components met vaporized fuel almost instantly. Fires followed with terrifying speed. Occupants often survived the initial impact, only to find themselves trapped in a burning car moments later. Door frames twisted in these crashes, jamming exits. Hinges bent, latches misaligned. Panic replaced relief as smoke filled the cabin. In an era before rapid emergency response and modern extrication tools, seconds mattered. Survivability depended less on injury severity than escape speed. Many occupants who should have lived did not. Front impacts were little better. The fragile frame rails buckled rearward, allowing the engine and drivetrain to shift violently. Fuel lines routed along the frame were stretched or torn. Leaks began immediately. Fires ignited not just after crashes, but during them. The Fleet Master did not merely allow post-crash fires, it invited them through structural weakness and poor fuel system protection. Inside the cabin, there was no refuge. The dashboard was steel, painted and sculpted for appearance, not impact. There was no padding worth mentioning. The steering column was rigid, aimed directly at the driver's chest. In frontal collisions, the column surged rearward as the driver surged forward. Steering wheels became blunt weapons. Sternums fractured, ribs collapsed. Internal injuries were severe even in crashes that looked moderate from the outside. Passengers fared no better. Front passengers struck steel dashboards directly. Rear passengers were thrown forward into rigid seatbacks and then into the unforgiving front cabin beyond. Seatbelts did not exist. Bodies moved freely inside a shrinking metal box that refused to absorb energy on their behalf. The suspension did nothing to help avoid these crashes. Tuned for comfort and cost, it allowed significant pitch and roll. Under hard braking, the nose dove sharply, unloading the rear and further destabilizing the car. Steering response was slow and vague. Emergency maneuvers arrived late and unpredictably. Drivers often lost control not because they panicked, but because the car could not respond quickly enough to save itself. What made the Fleet Master especially dangerous was how normal it felt. This was not a crude or alarming vehicle. It felt calm, smooth, and trustworthy. Noise was muted. The ride was gentle. Drivers underestimated speed because the car insulated them from sensation. Faster speeds reduced reaction time. Reduced reaction time demanded better braking and control. The Fleet Master offered neither. Medical and fire reports from the immediate post-war years paint a grim picture. Survivable trauma followed by fatal burns. Occupants with minimal external crash injuries but severe thermal damage. Repeated notes about fuel leakage and ignition. These were not anomalies, they were patterns. Chevrolet did not set out to build a death trap. The Fleet Master was a product of inertia. Engineering, tooling, and thinking carried forward because changing them was expensive and inconvenient. But when millions of cars share the same weaknesses, those weaknesses become public tragedies rather than private misfortunes. The cruel irony is that the Fleet Master often looked intact after severe crashes. Doors might still hang, roof lines often remained straight. From the outside, the car appeared survivable. Inside, occupants had absorbed forces the structure refused to manage and flames the fuel system could not contain. Only later would the industry begin to accept that fuel systems must remain intact in crashes, that frames must manage energy rather than merely bend, and that braking systems must be designed for worst-case scenarios, not average use. Those lessons were not born in laboratories. They were learned the hard way through cars like the Fleet Master. Today, the 1945 Chevrolet Fleet Master is often remembered fondly as a symbol of America's return to civilian life. Restored examples look dignified and reassuring, rolling reminders of post-war optimism. What those polished restorations cannot show is the fear of a driver pressing the brake pedal and realizing the car would not stop, or the terror of occupants trapped by fire after a rear impact that should have been survivable. The Chevrolet Fleet Master 1945 teaches one of the most unsettling lessons in automotive history. Danger does not always come from speed or recklessness. Sometimes it comes from sluggish engines that force risky decisions, brakes that erase margins, and structures that fail in the worst possible way after the crash has already happened. In the Fleet Master, rear impacts did not simply end journeys, they ignited them. And that reality stands as a stark reminder that post-war optimism, when paired with pre-war safety thinking, came at a terrible human cost.
The Nash 600 1945 was sold as a triumph of modern thinking at exactly the wrong moment. It promised efficiency, rigidity, and engineering progress when America was desperate to believe the future had finally arrived. Nash proudly advertised the 600's unitized body construction as advanced, aircraft-inspired, and stronger than anything built the old way. And in a narrow, technical sense, it was stronger. The problem was that strength without energy management is not safety. In real-world crashes, the Nash 600's rigid unibody did not absorb impact forces. It transmitted them directly into the passenger compartment. Survivability was grim, not because the car collapsed, but because it refused to. The Nash 600 entered the post-war world carrying pre-war ideas dressed up as innovation. Unibody construction eliminated the separate frame, reducing weight and increasing stiffness. On paper, this sounded like progress. Nash argued that a single, integrated structure would be safer because it was stronger and less prone to bending. What the engineers had not yet learned, or had not yet accepted, was that bending, controlled and deliberate, is exactly what saves human lives in a collision. In the 600, the body was the structure. There were no sacrificial frame rails designed to crumble first, no controlled collapse zones, no defined load paths meant to route energy away from occupants. When the car struck something, the force did not dissipate gradually. It traveled through the unibody shell like a shockwave, reaching the occupants almost instantly. In frontal collisions, the effect was brutal. The front of the Nash 600 was short, stiff, and uncompromising. When it hit an obstacle, the structure decelerated violently as a single mass. The firewall moved rearward, the floor buckled upward, pedals were driven toward the driver's legs. The engine and drivetrain shifted back, not gently, but abruptly. The unibody did not give way progressively, it carried the impact inward. The rigid steering column completed the violence. Bolted directly into the unibody structure, it had no collapse mechanism and no energy absorption. In a frontal crash, the column moved rearward with the structure at the same time the driver's body surged forward. The steering wheel met the chest and face with catastrophic force. Sternums fractured, ribs collapsed, internal organs were crushed. Survivable crashes became fatal because the car stopped the occupant too quickly. The rigid steel dashboard was another executioner. It was solid, painted metal shaped for style and simplicity, not impact. There was no padding to slow the head or chest. In collisions, occupants struck steel immediately. Faces shattered, teeth were knocked out, eye sockets fractured. Even moderate speed crashes produced injuries that modern observers would associate with far higher velocities. The Nash 600 did not cushion deceleration, it enforced it. Side impacts were no kinder. The unibody's rigidity meant there was very little lateral compliance. Doors and side structures did not absorb energy gradually. They moved inward as a unit. Intrusion into the passenger compartment was rapid and deep. Occupant space vanished before bodies could decelerate. Ribs, hips, and spines absorbed the blow directly. Survivability depended on angle and luck, not engineering. Rear impacts followed the same pattern. The rigid structure transmitted force forward, throwing occupants violently toward the front of the cabin. With no seatbelts, bodies were launched into rigid seatbacks and then into the unforgiving steel interior beyond. Fuel systems of the era were poorly protected, and deformation often compromised tanks and lines, adding fire risk to already severe trauma. What made the Nash 600 especially dangerous was how convincing it felt beforehand. The car was quiet, solid, and composed. The stiff structure eliminated squeaks and flecks. The ride felt tight and modern compared to softer, more flexible competitors. Drivers interpreted that tightness as safety. They trusted the car. They cruised confidently at speeds that post-war roads and pre-war safety thinking could not forgive. The braking system did nothing to compensate. Stopping distances were long, especially under repeated use. Fade arrived quickly. Drivers pressed harder and waited longer for results that never came. Rear-end collisions were common precursors to more serious crashes. The Nash 600 did not encourage reckless driving, it punished normal reactions with inevitability.
The suspension, tuned to complement the rigid structure, transmitted road shocks directly into the cabin. While this gave a sense of control in calm driving, it amplified forces during emergencies. Under hard braking, weight transfer was abrupt. Under steering inputs, responses were sharp but unforgiving. There was little margin, little warning, and little forgiveness when limits were reached. Medical reports from the immediate post-war period began to reveal a disturbing pattern. Occupants of rigid, unitized cars often suffered severe internal injuries without corresponding external vehicle damage. Doctors noted crushed chests, ruptured organs, and catastrophic head injuries in crashes where the car looked relatively intact. The structure had done its job by protecting itself. The Nash 600 was particularly instructive because it challenged the prevailing belief that strength alone equaled safety. It showed, brutally and repeatedly, that a car can be structurally sound and lethally hostile at the same time. The human body does not need strength in a crash. It needs time. Time to decelerate. Time for energy to be absorbed. Time that the Nash 600's rigid unibody simply did not provide. Passengers suffered disproportionately. Rear seat occupants, often children, were thrown forward violently without restraint into rigid front seatbacks and steel dashboards beyond. Parents trusted the car's modern engineering. The car repaid that trust with physics it could not soften. The cruel irony is that Nash was in some ways ahead of its time. Unibody construction would eventually become the industry standard, but it would only become safe when engineers learned how to make unibodies deform progressively, channeling energy away from occupants instead of transmitting it directly into them. The Nash 600 arrived before that understanding and paid the price in human lives. Crash survivability in the Nash 600 was grim not because the car failed catastrophically, but because it did exactly what it was designed to do. It stayed rigid, it stayed strong, and in doing so, it turned the occupants into the weakest structural element in the system. Only years later would the industry fully accept that controlled weakness is essential to safety. Crumple zones, collapsible steering columns, padded dashboards, reinforced occupant cells surrounded by sacrificial structures. These ideas were born from the wreckage of cars like the Nash 600. The lessons were learned in hospitals long before they were written into engineering standards. Today, the 1945 Nash 600 is often celebrated as an innovative milestone, a car that dared to break from tradition. And it was innovative, just not in a way that protected people. Restored examples look compact, purposeful, and modern even now. What those restorations cannot show is the violence hidden in that rigidity, the way impact forces raced through the structure and stopped human bodies in milliseconds. The Nash 600 teaches one of the most uncomfortable truths in automotive history. Safety is not about how strong a car is. It's about how intelligently it fails. A structure that refuses to absorb energy will always pass that energy to flesh and bone. In the Nash 600, innovation arrived without understanding. The unibody was rigid. The cabin was steel. The steering column was unforgiving. And when crashes happened, as they always do, the car survived remarkably well.
The Chevrolet Stylemaster 1945 was sold as a return to normalcy, a calm and civilized automobile meant to ease Americans back into civilian life after years of war. Chevrolet wrapped it in conservative styling, reassuring proportions, and the promise of smooth, dependable driving. To many buyers, it felt familiar in the best possible way: quiet, soft riding, and easygoing. But that very softness concealed one of the most dangerous traits a post-war car could have. With a suspension tuned almost exclusively for comfort and steering so vague it barely communicated intent, the Stylemaster had almost no high-speed stability. At the very moment when American traffic was getting faster and roads were opening up, the car became frighteningly unpredictable once speeds rose beyond the gentle pace it was truly designed for. The Stylemaster was not a new design born of post-war insight. It was a pre-war Chevrolet revived with minimal changes, pushed back into production as quickly as possible to meet massive pent-up demand. Engineering priorities had been frozen for years, and when factories restarted, they restarted old thinking along with old tooling. Chevrolet's focus was ride comfort, durability, and cost control.
not control at speed. In a slower, less crowded world, those priorities had seemed reasonable. In 1945, they were already obsolete. The suspension defined the Style Master's behavior. Springs were soft, deliberately so, allowing the car to float over rough pavement and broken post-war roads. Damping was weak, chosen to preserve that gentle ride rather than restrain motion. On city streets and at modest speeds, the effect was pleasant. The car felt smooth and forgiving, absorbing imperfections without complaint. Drivers relaxed, passengers felt at ease. Everything about the experience suggested safety. At higher speeds, that illusion collapsed. As speed increased, the Style Master suspension lost coherence. The body did not settle firmly on its springs. It continued to oscillate after bumps, swaying and floating instead of stabilizing. Expansion joints and uneven pavement nudged the car offline, and it took time for the suspension to recover. That recovery often never fully arrived before the next disturbance. The car felt as though it were always slightly behind the road, reacting after the fact instead of anticipating it. Steering only magnified the problem. The Style Master's steering was slow, light, and vague. Feedback from the front tires was minimal. Drivers could turn the wheels several degrees before the car responded meaningfully, and even then, the response arrived gradually, not decisively. At speed, this created a dangerous delay between command and action. Drivers instinctively added more steering to compensate. When the front end finally bit, it often did so abruptly, unsettling the rest of the car. That delay and lurch cycle was the heart of the Style Master's instability. On straight highways, especially those with crosswinds or uneven surfaces, the car wandered. Small corrections were constant. Drivers found themselves making continuous steering inputs just to keep the car tracking straight. Fatigue set in quickly, dulling reaction time and judgment. The car demanded attention without offering precision, and that imbalance mattered when something unexpected appeared ahead. Emergency maneuvers exposed the Style Master's limits brutally. A sudden obstacle, a slowing vehicle, or a narrowing lane required quick, decisive action. Drivers turned the wheel. The car hesitated. The body leaned heavily. Weight transferred slowly and unevenly. By the time the tires were fully loaded, the driver had often added more steering. The accumulated input arrived all at once. Grip broke unpredictably. Overcorrection followed. Control evaporated. At high speed, there was almost no margin. The Style Master did not gently slide or communicate its limits progressively. It drifted, leaned, and then suddenly gave up. Off-road departures were common outcomes, not because drivers were reckless, but because the car could not respond quickly enough to sudden demands. Braking made matters worse. The Style Master's brakes were marginal for the car's weight and the speeds it could now reach on improved post-war roads. Stopping distances were long, even when the system was fresh. Under repeated use, fade arrived quickly. Drivers pressed harder and waited longer for results that never came. In emergencies, braking and steering had to happen together. In the Style Master, that combination pushed the suspension into its weakest state. Under hard braking, the soft suspension allowed dramatic forward pitch. The nose dove sharply, the rear lightened. Tire contact became inconsistent. Steering precision dropped further just when accuracy was most critical. Instead of stabilizing the car, the suspension undermined it. The Style Master felt as though it were floating at the exact moment it needed to dig in. High-speed stability was not just poor, it was nearly non-existent. What made this especially dangerous was how convincingly the Style Master hid its flaws at lower speeds. Around town, the car felt docile and forgiving. It lulled drivers into trusting it. That trust carried over onto faster roads. Drivers assumed the same gentle behavior would continue as speed increased. It did not. The transition from calm to chaos was sudden and unforgiving. Inside the cabin, the illusion of safety persisted. The ride was quiet. Noise and vibration were muted. Speed felt lower than it was. Drivers underestimated how quickly they were traveling because the car insulated them from sensation. Higher speeds reduced reaction time. Reduced reaction time demanded sharper handling and better stability. The Style Master offered neither. When loss of control ended in impact, the interior revealed the final layer of danger. Like nearly all cars of its era, the Stylemaster featured a rigid steering column and a steel dashboard with minimal padding. In frontal crashes, the steering wheel surged rearward as the driver surged forward. Chest injuries were severe, sternums fractured, ribs collapsed, internal trauma followed. Heads struck steel dashboards. Facial injuries were devastating, even in crashes that did not look extreme from the outside. Passengers suffered similarly. Front passengers struck the steel dash directly. Rear seat occupants were thrown forward into rigid seatbacks and then into the unforgiving front cabin beyond. Seatbelts did not exist. Bodies moved freely inside a steel shell that refused to absorb energy on their behalf. The irony was cruel. The Stylemaster looked intact after many crashes. Doors often remained attached. Roof lines frequently stayed straight. To an observer, the car appeared survivable. Inside, occupants had absorbed forces the structure refused to manage. The lack of visible damage masked severe human injury. Accident reports from the immediate post-war period tell a consistent story. Vehicles leaving the roadway after evasive maneuvers, loss of control at speeds that should have been manageable, drivers unable to stabilize the car once it began to drift or sway. Investigators often cited instability and delayed response rather than reckless driving. The car did not forgive mistakes, it magnified them. Chevrolet did not intend to build a dangerous car. The Stylemaster was the product of inertia, engineering choices carried forward because changing them was expensive and inconvenient in a moment of overwhelming demand. Comfort sold cars. Stability at speed was invisible until it was desperately needed. The Stylemaster chose softness, and softness stole margin. The tragedy is that modest changes could have transformed the car's behavior. Firmer damping, better roll control, more precise steering geometry. None of these required revolutionary technology. They required a shift in priorities. That shift would come later, after too many cars like the Stylemaster had already taught the lesson the hard way. Doctors and first responders began to see patterns, severe injuries following loss of control crashes at relatively moderate speeds, trauma disproportionate to visible vehicle damage. These injuries were not mysteries, they were the predictable outcome of instability followed by violent deceleration inside rigid cabins. Today, the 1945 Chevrolet Stylemaster is often remembered fondly as a smooth, dignified post-war sedan, a symbol of America easing back into civilian life. Restored examples glide serenely at shows, praised for their ride comfort and quiet demeanor. What those polished moments cannot show is the moment when speed crept up, the steering grew vague, the suspension floated, and the driver realized the car no longer belonged to them. The Chevrolet Stylemaster 1945 teaches a lesson that still echoes through automotive history. Comfort without control is not safety. Soft suspension does not forgive emergencies, it delays them. Vague steering does not calm drivers, it robs them of information. High-speed stability is not a luxury feature. It is the thin line between correction and catastrophe. In the Stylemaster, that line was almost non-existent. The car felt gentle, civilized, and reassuring, right up until the moment it needed to respond quickly. When that moment came, the road took over, and the car simply followed, drifting wherever physics decided it should go.